in my judgment, from my practical experience in the Congress of 25 years and my 2.5 years in the White House, I firmly believe that trying to put on paper a precise procedure by which things have to be done in a crisis is impractical in the first place. And secondly, I believe it's unconstitutional as an undercutting of a president's responsibility as commander-in-chief of our military forces. And thirdly, I would add, and this is probably the most important point, a president of the United States, under any and all circumstances, has to maximize his efforts either to maintain the peace on the one hand or to achieve peace on the other. I firmly believe, as a practical matter, that the War Powers Resolution, with all its requirements, handicaps a president.
From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, war powers and the Constitution.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the war powers of the Congress and the President. The issue is one our founding fathers preferred, after much debate, not to spell out precisely in the Constitution, but which the Congress in the last 3 decades has been determined to interpret and define. Our subject, war powers and the Constitution. In broad strokes, the Constitution stipulates that the Congress shall have the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a navy. The President says the Constitution shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Now, interestingly, the Constitutional Convention, hammering out the language on war powers, discussed granting Congress the power to make war, but ultimately it decided on to declare war. Again, in broad strokes, the War Powers Act of 1973 requires the President, 1, to consult with the Congress, quote, in every possible instance, close quote, before U.S. armed forces enter hostilities, 2, to report to the Congress within 48 hours when forces are so committed, and 3, to terminate the engagement within 60 days if Congress hasn't declared war or specifically authorized use of the armed forces. Finally, it allows Congress within those 60 days to direct the President to withdraw by resolution passed by both houses, which will not require presidential signature. Where in truth lies the security and best interest of the United States in the allocation of war powers? Well, to chart a course out of this dilemma, we have a distinguished panel. To my far right, Representative Lee H. Hamilton, Democrat of Indiana, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He also serves on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. To my immediate right, Senator Charles Mathias, Jr., Republican and senior senator of Maryland. Senator Mathias is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and second-ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. To my immediate left, Representative Dick Cheney, Republican of Wyoming. Mr. Cheney served in the Ford administration as White House Chief of Staff. Congressman Cheney was elected to serve as chairman of the House Republican Policy Committee. And to my far left, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft. Before retiring from military service in the Air Force, General Scowcroft served in the White House as President Ford's National Security Advisor. More recently, General Scowcroft served as chairman of President Reagan's Commission on Strategic Forces. He was also coordinator of AEI's 1981 project on American vital interests in regions of conflict. Now, to begin, let us hear first the views of our 38th president.
Let me take a particular or specific example of what happened under the War Powers resolution during my administration. I'm sure people recall the seizure of the merchant vessel the Mayaguez in 1975, when the Cambodians illegally, under international law, seized an American merchant vessel off the shores of Cambodia. That precipitated, of course, a challenge to my administration. How could we get the crew back without any loss of life? How we could recover the ship itself. Under the War Powers Resolution, we would have been hamstrung and handicapped in trying to go through all of the procedures which were required. We had to take action, and we did. And the net result is the crew and the ship were recovered from the enemy. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't sit down and consult with the Congress. We tried to find them. And we were able to have an opportunity to have them come to the cabinet room, and we did tell them what the facts were. We outlined what we were going to do, which was successful. Members of Congress have many, many other duties. Their principal responsibility is not to be commander-in-chief. Therefore, their information as to what's transpiring on a minute-by-minute or an hour-by-hour basis, it's not available to them. A president, on the other hand, where the Constitution gives him the responsibility of being commander-in-chief, he has to know, by the hour at least, what's happening so he can act responsibly. You can't have 535 commander-in-chiefs. You can't have 535 secretaries of state. Their duties under our Constitution are different, important, but different from the president.
And now, panel, I would pose the same question to each of you in turn. Has the world changed so radically in 200 years that the Congress should attempt what our founding fathers were not willing to do in writing the Constitution, to specifically define and catalog the prerogatives and powers of the Congress and the executive in the exercise of war powers? Will you start, Senator Matthias?
Well, I would take issue, I think, with the question as it's framed. The authors of the Constitution made it very clear where the power over war and peace would rest. It's true that they made the president commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but they vested the decision as to war or peace solely in the Congress of the United States. They gave to the Congress the power to make rules and regulations for the governance of the armed forces. They provided that the Congress should make rules for captures on land or water. So they provided that the Congress should issue letters of marque, in other words, authorizing warlike acts by private vessels. So there is a panoply of power vested in the Congress by the Constitution, which makes it clear that the founders wanted the Congress to control the issues of war and peace. And what the War Powers Act does is merely to implement in a modern framework what I feel to be the very clear constitutional purpose.
Congressman Cheney.
I would take strong exception, John, with the views of my friend and colleague, Senator Matthias. I really believe that the notion of a declaration of war is almost an outmoded concept under virtually any set of circumstances we can conceive of under which a president would decide to commit troops to combat. I think in many respects it's a legacy of the Vietnam War. It's a statute that was adopted in an effort to keep us out of the next war based upon a misperception of how we got into the last one. It was put on the books, I think, with the expectation that had it been on the books in 1964 and 65, this nation would never have been involved in Southeast Asia. I simply believe that that's not the case. Congress consistently and continually supported that venture, and the War Powers Act hasn't changed that at all. I do believe very firmly that the War Powers Act is an unwise and virtually an unworkable intrusion by the legislative branch into the powers and prerogatives that a president needs to lead the United States in a very dangerous and hostile world.
Congressman Hamilton.
John, I support the War Powers Act. Edwin Corrin, the great constitutional scholar, said that the Constitution is an invitation to the Congress and the President to struggle for the privilege of conducting American foreign policy. And I think the War Powers Act simply reflects that struggle. The purpose of the War Powers Act is to guarantee that the Congress and the President will exercise their collective judgment on the most important question that government faces, and that is whether or not you go to war. In this day and age, with the extreme complexity of the modern world, the very rapid growth of America's responsibilities in that world, and the ambiguous nature of so many international conflicts, it seems to me that kind of a world demands that the Congress and the President should exercise their joint judgment, their collective judgment, on the critical question of whether or not you go to war. It's not a decision that ought to be made by one man or woman, even if that man or woman is the President of the United States. It ought to be a collective judgment.
General Scowcroft.
I think it's not so much that the world has changed in 200 years, but the United States and its role in the world has changed substantially. The Constitution did not legislate a government designed for maximum efficiency. It legislated a government designed to protect the rights of the individual against an overweening government, and it does that very well. The problem is that the inefficiencies that kind of freedom-protecting innovation dictates makes it very difficult for a world power involved in many areas or everywhere around the world to discharge its responsibilities. The struggle, as Congressman Hamilton indicated, between the executive and the legislature has swung back and forth over our history of predominance one way or another. I think that in very practical terms, the War Powers Act is the reflection of a time when, following a series of dynamic and activist presidents, the presidency was beset, both by Vietnam, by Watergate, and the Congress, in effect, seized an opportunity to make an inroad and to change the balance that had prevailed essentially since Roosevelt. I do believe that we must find ways that the executive and the legislature can cooperate in a discharge of the awesome business of conflict. But I think the War Powers Act, in the way it does it, in fact, not only ties the hand of the president, but in a sense makes conflict more likely.
Senator Farr.
Let me say that I agree with Dick Cheney that the War Powers Act grew out of the experience of Vietnam. I lived through that as a member of Congress. I voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And I think it's fair to say that most of us who did vote for it felt in some way, finally, as the facts were revealed, that we had been bamboozled and that there was no mechanism, no process by which the Congress could come to grips with a situation of that sort once the act has been done, once the resolution has been passed. I remember once riding in an automobile with President Johnson and expressing some doubts about the war, and he said, "Here, you voted for this resolution. Now, if you've got the guts, step up and introduce a resolution to repeal it." And he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a copy. He had one handy. We were really without a handle in which to debate these issues. And once troops are committed and casualties are being sustained and the level of patriotism in the country is up, it's very hard to grab hold of. So what the War Powers Act provides is a mechanism and a process by which the Congress can periodically review our involvement in foreign military adventures. And I think this is entirely consistent with what the founders of the Constitution proposed. James Madison, who probably knew more about the Constitution than any man who ever lived, once wrote to Thomas Jefferson that the Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature.
Congressman Cheney?
But I would, I guess, have to take exception with Mac. I think the War Powers
Take
Act...
exception with me, but you have trouble taking exception to Madison.
Well, obviously there are differences in terms of our interpretation of what the Constitution provides and with respect to whether the President or the legislative body has prime authority in this area. And I think most members of Congress, even individuals like myself who have serious problems with the War Powers Act, believe that the language of the Act that talks about consultation and notification is indeed perfectly appropriate. It's the notion of Congress being able to move in a very short period of time and terminate that commitment that bothers me a great deal. I look upon the Congress as being all too often swayed by public opinion of the moment, that there is not a certainty there or a conviction, the kind of determination or decision-making that would let them be an equal partner with the President with all of the resources that he has available to him in terms of making a broad policy decision that'll hold for a year or two. For example, of the Grenadan situation, where the Speaker of the House at the outset called it gunboat diplomacy, and within a matter of 2 weeks had changed his mind and said that indeed President Reagan had done exactly the right thing in sending troops into Grenada.
He was right the first time.
I think that Congress, unfortunately, is a pretty weak reed to lead on in terms of that kind of decision-making. I also would argue, Mac, that if the War Powers Act had been on the books in 1964 when the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was adopted, that it would not have altered the outcome at all, that Congress did indeed have the opportunity year in and year out throughout the history of our involvement in Southeast Asia to reject the course we were upon, and consistently year after year after year appropriated the funds for that exercise. So I really think it's a bit of a misreading of history to suggest that the War Powers Act might have altered the outcome in Southeast Asia.
Congressman Hamilton?
Well, I think the real question is whether the war-making power ought to be a decision made by one person or made by the President and the Congress. That seems to me to be the heart of it, and the War Powers Act simply says that the Congress is going to participate in that decision. Why shouldn't it? It seems to me that the guiding principle is that a democracy should go to war only with the consent of the people. Only with the consent of the people is expressed by their elected representatives. So I think the War Powers Act is totally consistent with the Constitution and with the Founding Fathers. Now, General Scowcroft speaks a moment ago about tying the hand of the President. Well, quite frankly, that's one of the things we want to do, tying the hands of the President. We want to make the President say to stop, to think, to listen before he commits us to war. That's what we want to do.
But is there a time recently when a President did not consult before committing troops?
Well, look what happened in Grenada. The President called in the Speaker and the Majority Leader at 8 o'clock in the evening. He did not consult with them. The Speaker of the House has said that. He said they were informed that the Marines were landing at 5:30 the next morning. There wasn't any consultation there. It was just a matter of informing. Informing is not consultation. At 8 o'clock, the Speaker learns about it. The rest of us learn about it in the newspaper. And the Marines go in at 5:30. That's not consultation. When Jimmy Carter, President Carter, sent the troops into Iran for a rescue mission, he didn't consult with the Congress.
The Congress already has adequate resources. It does control the purse strings. It does raise and maintain armies. If it doesn't like what the executive is doing, it has all the power it needs if it can get itself together to do it.
Well, that's
a
very slow power, though. It takes us a long time to do that. The advantage of the War Powers Act is within the 60-day period or within the 90-day period, the Congress has to act to approve or disapprove.
No, it doesn't have to act. That is one of the key problems. If it doesn't act by its own inaction, it makes a decision. Now that, it seems to me, is a supine way for the Congress to work its will. But the real practical effect of the War Powers Act is in the real world, the president sometimes has to introduce forces into an area to try to prevent a conflict, to try to stabilize a region, to try to prevent something from happening in terms of demonstrating our resolve. By telling our potential opponents that all they have to do is wait 60 days and see what happens, you have undercut his ability to demonstrate that kind of resolve that could prevent a conflict from occurring.
No, I disagree with that, General. What you've done is strengthen the decision to commit the troops. If a president commits troops and he does not have the support of the Congress and he does not have the support of the American people, he's not going to be able to sustain that commitment, and he's not going to be able to keep those troops there. We've learned that lesson very, very hard. If you're going to go into war, then you had better be very sure that you've got the support of the American people. If you don't have the support of the American people, you're not going to be able to sustain it. How do you get the support of the American people? One of the ways is to have the support of the Congress.
But
Let me, if I may, ask that we focus in on Lebanon. You played a major part in a compromise that was worked out, the terms of which were never specific, as I understand it, on whether the War Powers Act was being implemented or not implemented. But it has another peculiar framework to consider, which is that we're not introducing troops into Lebanon into hostilities. We were a peacekeeping force which we joined together with other nations.
I think the War Powers Act makes a very positive contribution to the management of the Lebanese situation. Far from perfect. As you point out, there are some ambiguities, both in the way the situation came about and how we structured the response. But for example, we made it very clear that the troops on the beach were to be limited to those who were there, who were present on the day the resolution passed.
In terms of numbers.
In terms of numbers. Mm-hmm. There are ambiguities about offshore forces, about the naval forces, but the troops on the beach, there was absolutely no question about that. It was totally specific. If we go beyond the number of Marines who were originally there has to be real congressional consultation, more than just advice.
John,
Yes,
John,
Mr.
if
Congressman.
I understood you correctly, you said that the War Powers Act was not implemented in the Lebanon situation. I think it was.
No, what I said was that there seems to be some confusion about whether it was applied or not, or is accepted as applied by both parties.
Well, it's very clear in the resolution that was passed that Section 4A1 was implemented in the resolution that we passed. President Reagan, when he signed it, did so with reservations. He obviously had some questions about it, but he did sign it. And this represents the first full use of the War Powers Act, as I understand it. That triggered the 60-day clause, it triggered the 90-day period, and now we have the first president on record as having implemented the War Powers Act.
Now, he did not accept the War Powers Act.
No, the president, when he accepted it by signing the bill. Now, when he signed the bill, he made a statement about his reservations about it. But the fact is, he signed the bill, and it is the law of the land. And the law specifically triggers the War Powers Act.
Mr. Hamilton, that's like the veto, single house veto. The presidents have signed numbers and numbers of bills, many presidents have, with that in it, many times stating that there is a constitutional problem. That doesn't mean that he acquiesces in that.
Congressman Cheney.
The fact, John, that two such obviously intelligent and bright and distinguished gentlemen as General Scowcroft and Congressman Hamilton can't even agree on what we did in the case of the Lebanon resolution strikes me as pretty hard evidence that it is a very difficult piece of legislation and probably unworkable. I think from this, and I would certainly support Brent's views in terms of what the administration did. Also, I was fascinated by the debate on the issue when it came to the floor of the House, because the debate, if I recall, had nothing to do with should we be there or shouldn't we be there. Nobody offered an alternative that said everybody out now. The alternative was it's going to be 60 days or 90 days or 180 days or 18 months. And oftentimes the debate over how many days it should be and whether we ought to add a month or take a month off has very little to do with the substance of policy. It has a lot to do with the posturing of my colleagues and whether or not you can build a majority for 6 months instead of 9 months. I think it's a bad way to make policy. I also think, as Mac pointed out, the limitation on troops on the beach is very unwise. If you're going to commit military force to a potentially hostile situation, one of the key ingredients to having it have any effect at all is the uncertainty that it creates in the minds of your adversary. And if you have at the outset said, yes, we're going to commit troops, but you can't have any more than 1,600 on the beach under any foreseeable set of circumstances, it seems to me you've defeated the purpose of having any troops there in the first place.
Senator?
2 points. One, this time factor, of course, is not an absolute termination of the operation. The time factor is a period of time after which the Congress will make a review and after which there will be further consultation. And as Lee Hamilton says, a joint decision by the Congress and the executive as to whether or not the operation shall be continued and maintained or whether it should be terminated. Now, it is the point that never came in Vietnam in a formal, structured way, and that's the thing that was missing in the Vietnam debate. The executive could simply roll over the Congress. The other point that I wanted to make was this, that of course, it's true, as Dick says, that if you say we're going to get out in a limited period of time, that may make your adversary procrastinate and not come to terms with reality. But it also, in the Lebanese situation, could make your friends there rest on their arms, not really engage in the hard political process of bringing about a reconciliation of the conflicting interests within Lebanon, because the longer they keep us there, the longer they don't have to come to terms with the realities of political life in Lebanon. So I think that there are two sides to the question of the uncertainties that are created by a limited time frame.
What about the big, at least in my view, the big constitutional question mark, which is the right reserved to the Congress to direct the president to pull out even in the 60 days and constitute, in effect, a legislative veto of his actions, with the Supreme Court holding, certainly in other circumstances, that the legislative veto was unconstitutional. Does that bother you?
I would have to say that I think that the decision that the court did hand down does in fact not bode well for the legislative veto features of the War Powers Act, and that the War Powers Act, in terms of the provision you cite, would require the President to take an action by a simple majority vote of both houses of Congress, and that is indeed a violation of the separation of powers.
I think I basically agree with Dick's observation on it. The provision of the War Powers Act, which permits the Congress to pull out the troops with a concurrent resolution, is highly suspect now with the Supreme Court decision. And my guess would be that it's probably unconstitutional. There is a separability clause in the War Powers Act. The likelihood, I think, would be that the balance of the act might still stand, although that may be in dispute as well. But I think Dick is quite right in saying that that provision may very well be unconstitutional.
Of course, that doesn't affect a large part of the War Powers Act. The original statutory 60-day limitation on the use of troops overseas is not affected by the Supreme Court decision. That's pristine and untouched. The provisions on the growth of forces, or the change of mission, or the change of scope of the mission, all of that is untouched by the Supreme Court decision.
I don't have any particular comment on the Chadha decision, but it seems to me that's only one of several areas where the constitutionality of the act is, well, at best dubious.
Mr. Congressman or Senator, would you look kindly upon members of the Congress specifically serving with the National Security Council and feel that that would give you...
No, I think that causes real constitutional problems. We are committed to the philosophy of separation of powers, and I don't see how you could have that kind of an overlap, and I think that would cause problems. Consultation, I think, I don't find as much trouble with it as you seem to. I think it was entirely proper to call in the legislative leadership, and if the impropriety occurred not in the people that were chosen, in my view, but the fact that they didn't consult.
John, if it's appropriate, can we pursue just for a moment the
General Scowcroft wanted...
No, that's all right.
You want to go on?
Go ahead.
Right,
that's not, you were going to talk about consultation.
Yes, I wanted to follow on with what Mac said, and the problem in part, Mac, is trying to define what would have been acceptable. Let's take Grenada for an example. You had a situation in which the president believed American lives were at stake. How, under those circumstances, when the whole train of events only lasted a few days from the time the problem arose until action was taken, what would be an acceptable consultation process?
I'll tell you exactly. The critical decisions were being made down there on the golf course in Atlanta. And Tip, the speaker, plays golf. He could have, I mean, if you wanted to really have a consultation, you could say, Tip, come down here and play a round of golf with me. And he could join in those conversations that took place in the clubhouse and on the 9th hole.
Even with the consultation that the speaker had, and I was present the morning of the event when the president met with a larger group and he had the bipartisan leadership in.
After the fact.
This was at the time that the invasion was actually underway already. There wasn't one single member in the room of either party, some 30 members from the House and Senate in the room, not one single member in the room who raised a question about the operation. But 3 days later, the speaker was out publicly condemning the president for gunboat diplomacy, and 10 days later, once he had all the facts, once he had sent a delegation down to look at what had happened in Grenada and asked some questions, came back, he said, whoops, I was wrong, it was indeed a good operation. How do you deal with that kind of situation if you're the president and you're trying to have some kind of reasonable, rational decision-making process? Isn't Grenada a classic example not of a decision to go to war, but rather of a commander-in-chief to take action to save American lives? And therefore the War Powers Act probably shouldn't even apply at all, even if we buy your arguments about what the purpose of the act is.
Well, I don't think so, Dick. After all, we committed combat troops in a very major way. Those combat troops met resistance. They were fired upon. We sustained casualties. We had people killed in war, or in the invasion, or in the rescue operation, whatever you want to say. Now, the fact that it turns out that the American people strongly supported the action, and I think the Congress strongly supported the action, I don't think is the relevant point here. There was a period of time when the president was in the process of making the decision, should we go into Grenada? The question of consultation, if you have the right kind of a spirit prevailing here, it seems to me, would be to invite congressional leadership in, and no member of Congress could complain, I think, if that leadership were the leadership of the two parties in the both houses of the Congress, and restricted only to that group, and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing. The important point is prior consultation. The order to invade or to go in for the rescue had already been made. The president had signed that order prior to the 8 o'clock meeting. He did not call those leaders in to consult. He had already made up his mind to commit American troops for combat purposes, and he did not consult with the leaders of Congress.
If he had consulted, what might have been the outcome?
Well, I don't know, but you have to have you have to give the opportunity, it seems to me. These are tough questions. Maybe the question is not as tough in the Grenada situation as it would be in many, many others. But the principle is, it seems to me, that the most important decision that government makes is whether or not to go to war. That is the paramount decision that government makes. Should that decision be made by one person, or should it be made by that person, the president, and the Congress?
There were people who disagreed strongly with the executive's exercise of War Powers Act, but who did not want the War Powers Act of 1973 on the grounds that that gave him powers which were not his under the Constitution. That thread of debate ran continuously, so that the suggestion there is really that why don't we stay where we are?
I don't think the War Powers Act alters the president's constitutional powers. They are what they are. And the War Powers Act doesn't change that. Now, that argument is made, I grant you. It's applied most often, I think, to the initial 60-day period in which the president has an open license. They say that the Constitution doesn't give him any days, 60, 30, 20, 10, right. Any days. And therefore, to say that a president can act during the 60-day period without congressional authorization, it somehow enhances his power. I don't think it does that. That was a device that was built into the law. I think the War Powers Act doesn't prevent the president from making foreign policy decisions. It simply says that they should be coordinated with the Congress.
I certainly agree with that there should be consultation, and with the right spirit, it can be worked out. Trouble, with the right spirit, you don't need the War Powers Act. With the wrong spirit, the War Powers Act really doesn't affect the executive. I mean, suppose the president consults as broadly as you want, and the verdict is that he shouldn't do something. There's nothing that prevents him from going ahead and doing it.
That's right.
So that
For a while.
For a while.
But that was always there, wasn't it, in the power of the purse?
But then, for the while, it seems to me you get into another clear issue of constitutionality. And that is, if the role of commander-in-chief does not include the right to move troops around, then it is an absolute meaningless term. And the Congress arrogates it to itself by its inaction to force the president to do something which the Constitution says he doesn't have to do. In other words, to pull the troops out by its own inaction, not even by saying to the president he shouldn't do that for these or that or the other reasons, but just because it's unable to make up its own mind, it is forcing the president not to behave as if he were
The point,
commander-in-chief.
Brent, it seems to me, is that the war-making powers are clearly divided in the Constitution.
Clearly.
You don't give all the power to the president, you don't give all the power to the Congress. It's a shared power. And that's all we're trying to say in the War Powers Act. When you make a decision to go to war, let's be sure it's a shared collective judgment.
But Lee, it was shared before. Take the Cooper Church amendments in Vietnam that cut off our use of military forces in and over Cambodia and so on and so forth. There are many ways for the Congress to insert in legislation the kinds of restriction it feels are important, and without an item veto, the president is stuck with them.
Well, I think one thing, we've covered this subject very, very broadly, and I'm sure our audience would like to have a chance to participate in, so I think it's time for the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
Yes, my name is John Round with the faculty at Clackamas Community College in Oregon City, Oregon. My question is for Representative Cheney. In the event that the Supreme Court would declare the War Powers Act of 1973 as unconstitutional due to infringing the President's power to commit troops, what legislative alternatives would you propose in this case?
My own personal view is that we don't need the War Powers Act. If the court strikes it down, I would expect that it would be on the basis of the provision that we discussed up here earlier. That is to say that it constitutes a legislative veto. The President doesn't have the opportunity himself to veto that act by the Congress, and therefore it violates the separation of powers. I think, as Mac and Lee and Brent have all said, that the heart of having the relationship work between the President and the executive branch and the executive branch and the Congress in this area is basically a requirement for a good faith effort on both sides. And my own personal view is that Congress already has adequate restrictions and restraints and powers and authority on the books, so that they are in a position to be able to intervene if a president does make a serious mistake. They do have the power of the purse. They do have the opportunity to hold hearings and conduct oversight investigations and decide whether or not Congress wants to sustain that effort after the fact. But that in the 1980s and in the years ahead, we're very unlikely to find ourselves in a set of circumstances where the kind of conflict that is envisioned in the War Powers Act is likely to arise. And that presidents have to be trusted to some extent, that once they're elected, we delegate to them enormous authority, directly and indirectly. We build nuclear weapon systems, and we give them total control over those systems without consultation with the United States Congress whatsoever. And it seems to me, having made that leap of faith, that we are in fact going to trust the President to be Commander-in-Chief under those circumstances, we can also trust him in other areas, and that there's no need for a replacement, if you will, for the War Powers Act should that be struck down.
Senator Matthias?
I think there is a subjective value to the War Powers Act that perhaps hasn't been sufficiently appreciated. During the debate in which it was first adopted, Senator Javits used to say that it was like a sign at a railroad crossing, that it was simply saying stop, look, and listen before you embark on this journey overseas. And I think that's the effect that we hoped it would have on the executive branch. But there is a subjective effect on the legislative branch, which is not without some importance. And that is that in a non-adversarial way, it provides a framework in which you can examine an operation. Now, when I introduced the resolution, I think it was in 1969, to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, finally took up Lyndon Johnson's challenge. That was, in fact, an adversarial action. But the kind of periodic reviews that are provided in the War Powers Act don't have to be adversarial. People will take sides within the debate, but the existence of the debate itself becomes a matter of procedure and is neutral as to the event.
I would like to suggest that is not the way it is viewed by the executive branch, that it is an irritant to the executive branch and considered broadly a congressional attempt to infringe on the prerogatives of the president. And in fact, it prevents the kind of free will cooperative consultation which I think is the fundamentally real answer to our problem.
I must say, I come back to the basic notion, Mac, that I don't think we can find an example in modern times when a president hasn't done what the War Powers Act expects him to do anyway, to the extent that we talk about consultation and notification. I don't know of anybody who served in the presidency in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, and probably longer than that if I went back far enough, who would have made a decision in a high-handed, arrogant fashion to commit troops in a way that ultimately lacked the kind of public support, broad public support that it requires. Certainly that wasn't Lyndon Johnson's intent when he got involved in Southeast Asia. Certainly that wasn't the congressional intent when they supported it. In the end, public opinion swung against it. But it took years of developments and gradual constant escalation of our involvement there, but there's nothing in the War Powers Act, had it been in place in 1964 or 65, that would change that. And I think we do have to rely to some extent on good faith interpretation of our responsibilities, both as legislators and executives. And I think that history would bear out the statement that in fact that good faith effort has been there in virtually every case.
Senator?
One of the premises in which we're meeting is to discuss constitutionality, and therefore I drag you back to the history of the Constitution, which,
Thank you, Senator.
which I think is pertinent. The executive side of this argument is presented as the need to repose confidence in the judgment of the president and his advisors. Alexander Hamilton was never thought to be soft on the executive. He was always viewed as a strong executive advocate. But he said in writing the Federalist Papers that the history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue which would make it wise in a nation to commit interests of so delicate and momentous a kind as those which concern intercourse with the rest of the world to the sole disposal of a magistrate created in circumstance as would be a president of the United States. And I think there is a kind of concern expressed at the very birth of the Republic that reflects the problems that we are discussing here this evening.
I would agree with that, but I think, to imagine that the world is different and therefore the framers, in a sense, didn't know what they were doing or what have you is wrong. There's been a recent study that about 10% of the military engagements between 1780 and 1880 were consequent to a declaration of war, that is around the world. So that the idea that undeclared wars are a recent phenomenon.
The degree is different, but
true.
the degree is different, but the circumstances are pretty standard.
But in the process of writing the Constitution, as I think, I can't remember who said it now, the words to make war were deliberately changed to declare war. Now that cannot have been accidental.
Well, it wasn't accidental. It was a result of debate.
And it seems to me that that's a very important change. One is, in a sense, recognizing a situation, if you will. The other is initiating a
But
situation.
Hamilton, who was there, argues that the power was not vested solely in the president and should not have been.
And it is not.
And should not have been.
And it is not, because the Congress raises and maintains armies.
Well, we have to get another question. Is somebody, you're next, are you, sir? Yes, sir.
I'm Robert Goldwyn, Director of Constitutional Studies of American Enterprise Institute. Senator Mathias, that passage from Alexander Hamilton you just quoted was in reference not to making war or declaring war, but in reference to the power, the constitutional advice and consent on treaties. And I think that raises an interesting question related to what Congressman Hamilton was saying about bringing Congress into the decision-making. Do you mean some kind of consenting role in the same sense as advise and consent with regard to treaties? That is, would you really try to restrict the power of the president to the extent that when he did consult with members of Congress and they gave him opposing advice or conflicting advice, as congressmen and senators want to do, that is, they disagree among themselves, then what does the president do? Do you really mean that the congressman should have some role in the decision-making power? Because that then puts in real question the whole principle of separation of powers.
I think we made that clear in reference to General Scowcroft's question about whether members of the legislative branch should serve on the National Security Council. I think that clearly would be a violation of separation of powers, and under the American Constitution as we know it today, it wouldn't be proper. And I'm not suggesting that. I think what Hamilton was looking at was foreign policy, and war is, of course, the ultimate extension of foreign policy, the ultimate act of foreign policy. And so I think it's clearly comprehended within his thinking. It seems to me that what we're saying is that there must be a coordinate decision made. Now, I don't see how we can ever embody in a statute precisely how this will occur. Lee Hamilton has one kind of personality. Dick Cheney has a kind of personality. There will be presidents with which one of them will be simpatico and presidents which the other one will not. And these human factors get into the act. General Scowcroft and Dick Cheney, both having served in the highest positions in the White House, know how personalities become important elements of policy making and decision execution. But I think that's one reason that it's impossible to create an absolutely rigid, hidebound system of consultation. That from administration to administration, it's going to change a little bit. But I think the factor is that that the president be exposed to all the considerations before the decision is made.
You ask, should the Congress consent? Why shouldn't the Congress consent? What's wrong in a democracy by making a judgment in a democratic manner? That's all we're asking.
Are you saying that the consent should be mandatory on the president? Should be binding on the president?
No, the question was, should the Congress consent to the decision? And I see nothing wrong with the Congress consenting.
But again, Lee, we come back to the proposition that most of the times when military force has been used in recent years, simply haven't been circumstances which lent themselves to that kind of
What
process.
kind of a war can the President of the United States carry out if the Congress of the United States doesn't consent?
Well, but in many respects, again, we've already given prior approval, in a sense. We have appropriated the funds and raised the Army and purchased the equipment and built the missiles and the bombers and said, okay, here now you have the authority to make decisions about how we're going to use certain elements of that. To suggest that you can go to the Congress and involve the Congress as deeply as I think you would like to in the decision in advance of the actual commitment of troops just strikes me as not very practical.
I simply have to raise a caveat that the existence of the defense establishment is in some way an authorization to the President to start out on foreign adventures. I don't believe that.
It's a recognition that we live in a dangerous and hostile world, and from time to time we may have to defend ourselves and defend our interest, and that the individual we look to make those decisions, especially those that take on the nature of a decision of a commander-in-chief rather than a legislative body, we entrust to the President.
But I think, as Brent Scowcroft has said, we entrust that final decision to the President, but we have confidence that the Secretary of State will have his say, that the Secretary of Defense will have some comment, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff will talk about the military feasibility, that the Central Intelligence Agency will provide basic information, that the whole apparatus of government will be brought to bear. Now, at some point in that decision-making process, and I certainly would not have meant to imply that I thought that this is something the President decides in the shower bath on his own, that somewhere in this process there is room and time to register the congressional point of view.
I think you have to draw a distinction between two situations. One is the emergency situation. Dick, you refer to that frequently, and I think you're probably correct in that. There are going to be times when a president has to act. Arguably, that was Grenada. The American citizens had to be rescued right now, and the president really didn't have time. I can see how you can make a case for the president moving very quickly on that. But that's not the only time a president is, or the only matter in which a president is going to be confronted with the decision to commit troops. Should we invade Nicaragua today? That's a possible question on the agenda of the country. If I were a president reflecting on that question today, I'd like to call Mac Mathias and talk with him about it, and talk with some others about it too. And that's what we're saying, and it seems to me that kind of a situation is very different from the emergency situation.
But I think we need to be clear about another thing, and that is the War Powers Act does not say the President will not attack this or that or the other. It really says the President may not move troops. That's what it's talking about. May not introduce troops in certain areas. Seems to me that is fundamental.
In certain circumstances in which hostilities are imminent.
That's right, but it's back to Dick's point about having raised armies, what can the president do with them? And it seems to me that if the commander-in-chief cannot deploy and move his forces around, then the term commander-in-chief is absolutely meaningless. And we're not talking about specifically going to war here. There is nothing about that in the War Powers Act.
We're talking about hostilities, and that is in the War Powers Act.
Where it is possible. We're not talking about the president using forces offensively, deliberately to attack.
All right, next question, please. Who has the microphone? All right, we get your microphone now.
I'm Terry Emerson, counsel to Senator Barry Goldwater, who voted against the War Powers resolution. I make a quick comment on Alexander Hamilton because I've read his works. In a famous set of written debates with James Madison, Hamilton did make a clear distinction between offensive war and defensive war. He said the Congress can commence offensive war through the declaration power, but the President possesses the defensive power to initiate defensive actions on behalf of the United States. My question to the panel would be to any member who would wish to make a test of the War Powers resolution against the history immediately preceding World War II. Take the actions of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. In 1940, Congress had barely renewed the military draft by a single vote. Yet in 1941, President Roosevelt, before any declaration of war, sent American Marines equipped for combat to both Greenland and Iceland. He gave them orders to cooperate fully with British armed forces who were already there defending the islands against Nazi Germany. Franklin Roosevelt also ordered the American Navy to escort British shipping in the North Atlantic and to shoot on sight against German U-boats, all this before any declaration of war. Under the War Powers Resolution, Congress would have been faced with having to vote within 60 days on whether to extend President Roosevelt's powers. I ask whether testing the War Powers Resolution in this situation would not have led to a total disaster for the democracies of the world through an isolationist Congress refusing to ratify President Roosevelt's wise actions.
Who would like to start?
I'll simply say that the gentleman, I think, stated the case eloquently. I think he's absolutely right.
Sir?
Well, I think it's only a hypothetical judgment is what might have happened if the War Powers Act had been in effect. It is so difficult to project. It's true for by way of example how unpredictable history is. It's true that Senator Goldwater voted against the War Powers Resolution, but thereafter he called for the immediate withdrawal of the Marines from Lebanon. So I don't know what real conclusions you can draw.
This concludes another Public Policy Forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Representative Lee H. Hamilton, Senator Charles Mathias, Jr., Representative Richard Cheney, Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, and also our thanks to our guests and experts in the audience for their participation. Goodbye from Washington.
It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by doing so, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, publicly supported research and education organization. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.